I'm Araz Marachelian. I'm a pediatric oncologist at Children's Hospital Los Angeles and have been here for actually some 20 years. I am also the medical director of the New Approaches to Neuroblastoma Therapy Consortium. So I have these two parts of my job. One is the more clinical, the neuroblastoma program at CHLA, and the other is the NANT Consortium. My work focuses on really neuroblastoma in its entirety. So involves working on clinical trials. My focus is really on immunotherapy and minimal residual disease, but I really work with a group of physicians and scientists to make all kinds of trials happen and make advances in neuroblastoma. So NANT is an interesting, fun organization founded in the early 2000s, actually, by a group of scientists and physicians who recognized really that, children with relapse refractory neuroblastoma had very limited options and that we needed to make progress. And the progress we can make in relapse refractory neuroblastoma then helps the upfront therapy for neuroblastoma. And so the idea was to bring lots of really great minds together and have trials that can focus on these patients. So it was a consortium created with this expertise and bringing the patients and giving them access across the country. It started off with the US, and then Canada was the next one that was added. And since then, there's been some expansion into Europe as well. But really, the goal is both access as well as obviously making lots of progress in the disease. So there are about 15 institutions in North America and Europe currently. And you can imagine if there are 15 institutions, there's dozens of physicians and scientists contributing. Each one of them brings patients' expertise and helps us run these trials that no hospital can achieve alone. So our purpose is always to develop and test these new therapies, and they come from the laboratory many times, and other times they come from the clinical side. So some of the early trials in neuroblastoma and the NANT were very MIBG focused. So NANT pioneered a lot of the studies in trying to figure out dosing, safety, and feasibility. This work paved the way to the Children's Oncology Group trial that incorporated MIBG into its frontline treatment in a randomized fashion. The other trials have really been a variety. One of them, for example, is the lorlatinib trial. This was a first in pediatrics ALK inhibition because subset of neuroblastoma has an ALK aberration or some abnormality in the ALK gene, and this really needs to be targeted. This is one of our precision therapy trials that led to the first pediatric trial of lorlatinib in ALK-driven neuroblastoma. And then since then, that has moved over to also to Children's Oncology Group. And this trial sort of describes how the laboratory work in the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia sort of moved over to our clinical trial and then moving over to Children's Oncology Group, which is a beautiful sort of transitions from the laboratory to upfront therapy patients. There have been a few others, for example, DFMO combinations with chemo were also piloted in the NANT that I moved to Children's Oncology Group. And there have been a few immunotherapy trials that we're really proud of. One of them includes immunomodulation, drugs that try to make the antibody work better. So a lot of the work is refining how antibodies can be paired with other agents. And there's some trials that are upcoming that are based on some of this work. And I suspect we'll have many more in that arena because that has been really a big focus currently in figuring out how to pair these antibodies with different agents. So the therapy neuroblastoma is constantly evolving. And I'm super proud of that because I could say with some of my other colleagues from other diseases, I think neuroblastoma is unique in how much progress has been made. So things like the transplant that was highlighted actually in the early NANT that moved over to Children's Oncology Group, as well as antibody therapy. Of course, our treatment is long still. It takes about a year and a half to complete for the upfront therapy. And where we're going is really figuring out subsets of patients, for example, the ALK aberrant tumors to get ALK inhibition, but also just improving immunotherapy throughout. So chemoimmunotherapy and how that gets incorporated. And I think generally we've been adding things, and at some point we may be taking things away as more active agents come along. But really, we need to test everything at the right time so that it can actually be successful. In the end, we're making improvement in survival for patients in the upfront setting, as well as patients who have a relapse. But we still have a bit to go. And that's what, NANT is about, and trying to see how we can make more progress. I think it's maybe accelerated access, right, to innovation, because if you are working together as centers, you can test the therapies faster because you're collaborating with the basic scientists, or what I call translational scientists, and then translating that, having the right infrastructure that's quick, that can change that from the laboratory to a clinical trial. Ultimately, each clinical trial, no matter how successful it is in reducing tumor, is successful in figuring out how to make therapy in neuroblastoma better. Because with each patient, we go back to the laboratory, we learn from the samples. And so this wouldn't exist without this collaboration. And for families, it really means, hope. And for the field, it just means we're making real advances in the standard of care. And that's ultimately our goal. I think it's incremental progress that we have to be patient with, which is sometimes hard. I think from the beginning, when NANT was created, the idea was always to do trials that were early on. So these, what we call phase 1, phase 2 in select institutions. But once we get to phase 3, to have it, group wide in the Children's Oncology Group. And this system of collaboration is just the building blocks of how neuroblastoma has improved overall. So for example, many of us in the NANT are also on the Neuroblastoma Steering Committee in the Children's Oncology Group. So we're working together, and there's sort of what I call the embedded different people and from the different groups, so that we can keep an eye on what is really needed in the upfront setting. But at the same time, when we're, for example, working with the basic scientists and sitting there and thinking about a mouse experiment, we're thinking about, like, is that feasible for patients? Does that make sense for patients? Where does it fit in the overall treatment of patients? So it's not just, well, let's try this, and I have no idea where it might go. And so, you have the lab scientist, you have NANT, which is sort of translating this to the patients from the beginning, figuring out dosing, figuring out safety, figuring out, is this worth doing bigger studies for? Because not everything should move forward, right? There are some things we can decide, this was good, but not good enough. And so I think NANT's role is that. But then at the same time, it's, you have to be in a place where you can do that fast. If you are slow and you're constantly just recreating, how you do this, then you're already lost too much time, then it's no longer relevant. So you have to be in a infrastructure that's ready, that's constantly communicating with the laboratory, but then also with the children's oncology group so that it's meaningful and meaningful changes for the future of patients. And that's the only way that can happen. And I do think that it's quite unique in neuroblastoma. And there's been some other diseases that have tried to sort of make the same kind of structure. And I think it's the winning structure because that's the only way to really have your head in both places, in the laboratory, in the end for newly diagnosed, so you can figure out what the right thing is. I think it's cool. If you think about it, so much of the treatment of neuroblastoma is happening in the early phases, because we have a group of patients who still need these innovative therapies. And so NCCN guidelines inform the patients, but inform the community and inform insurers. There's a lot of people who really rely on this. And so it is very important for us to include data that's preliminary yet promising in there, because otherwise it takes a long time to get everything approved. And so we have to be a little bit smart about saying, hey, for example, I know this drug and this drug, there was a signal. It was very exciting. There's a good signal. And that's what I would do for our patients. I may, not everything is a phase 3 question. Like we talked about, we can only answer a big question every 5 to 7 years. And so there are some things we can deduce. This one is similar to this one can be added to this. Those things are really helpful to inform the overall group that something has a possibility of working for a patient so that it could get approved. So I think there've been more than 25 clinical trials that NANT has enrolled. At any given time, we try to have 3, 4, maybe 5 studies. Currently, we have actually just 2 trials open, but we have a couple other trials that are opening very soon. So our pipeline is really dependent on, some of our collaborations with pharma and all these other groups. And so there's sometimes some lulls, but I think we're never in a complete lull. I'm excited that we have a new group of studies coming up in the beginning of the year. When you think about the big picture, like the real big picture, in neuroblastoma, we can only ask one very big question, like in the phase 3 setting, every 5 to 7 years. We can do some overlap, but generally, because of the number of patients, you just, in order to really figure out if something makes a difference in what we call event-free survival or overall survival in patients, you can only answer one big question like that 5 to 7 years. So what do you do? I mean, you mean there's no other research in 5 to 7 years? Obviously, that's not the case. What's happening is while we are asking a big question, is antibody better than no antibody? Whatever it was, the question, there's a lot of work that's going on in the NANT as well as in Children's Oncology Group in figuring out, A, what should be the next question and have as little gap as possible. And then B, what can we learn while the trial's ongoing? We can't learn, is this treatment better than this? But maybe some biological things that we can understand while we're going on. Ultimately, for example, the antibody trials, the initial antibody trials dinutuximab took about 20 years to get FDA approval, right? Like, I think it was a very long time period. Ultimately, we want this to be shorter, but we do have to be patient enough. So, for example, if we all believed we knew the answer and we didn't randomize, we get into these places where we have agents, kind of, but they're not FDA approved because we never did a randomized trial. We didn't design the trial well. And in the end, patients don't have access. So we have to be careful and really manage our expectations and our desire for the speed versus our desire for scientific integrity so that in the end things get available. So it's a really tricky place to be, but one that is really important to strike the right balance so that patients have access, but patients have access for a long time. And we can't all be believers, right? If we believed we knew the answer always, then we are no longer scientists. And then if everything we thought we were experimenting is the real thing, then we are no longer scientists, because we have to come through it with a hope that it works better, and but still having this idea that we have to ask the question and not come in with a preconceived opinion about what the answer is going to be. And that's tricky. Of course, that's really one of the hardest times in the life of every parent, just because there's so many questions and so much unknown. I think just taking things day at a time for the direct treatment of the patient, but then also being well informed and talking to big centers so that they can understand the why and the how of a neuroblastoma. For certain families, I think that's really helpful, because there's some people who are in small centers and they want, having that reassurance from others who are in the field every day is likely beneficial for peace of mind, as well as potentially for, some changes to treatment as needed. Because ultimately you want every family to have access to innovative therapies and be able to also have a group of people who are really invested in neuroblastoma should the treatment not go the way it was planned. Because there are some times when we do have to pivot, and it's important to have that structure so that you have a group of people who know about your patient and can help you navigate. Because this is not a road traveled alone, right? I think we're a group of people that really want to help all the families get through this crazy journey. I think some of our expansion in Europe has been really a great collaboration. And I think having more transatlantic studies is going to be very important, because then we can maybe make progress faster and have more collaborations with pharma. Really, the future is still, I think, there's precision and immunotherapy and liquid biopsies. And there's a lot of aspects of this that are growing, including cellular therapy. But ultimately, our future is dependent on, all our work with all the different individuals. And I think with this expansion, we're positioned to remain a leader in the early phase trials in neuroblastoma, no matter what type of treatment we are looking for, because ultimately, for every patient, there is not one key therapy. It's likely combination of things. And so being involved in all of it and making that progress is the way to go. Whenever I talk about neuroblastoma, just to end that this is not a one woman, one man job. And there's a really an amazing group of scientists together with the clinicians that make this happen. And I think for parents, it might be reassuring that there are people who really are dedicating their life to try and make progress here in this space.